Yesterday, we left off talking about the Texas question, whether the United States should annex Texas or not. In that context, we talked about the election of 1844 and James K. Polk, who's considered the first what we call a dark horse candidate, somebody who came relatively out of nowhere and actually won his party's primary, the Democratic primary. The Whigs were a bit dissatisfied with their performance in the previous election, the Log Cabin Campaign of 1840, where they had actually put all their eggs in that basket in order to win. They ran William Henry Harrison, popular war general. They ran the Democrat, John Tyler, in order to poach votes from the Democratic Party as the vice presidential nominee. And then they took for granted the fact that all the Whigs would vote for them. They won that election, but 33 days later it backfired because William Henry Harrison died and John Tyler, a states' rights Democrat, became president and began to subsequently veto all the Whig legislation. James K. Polk then wins the nomination, wins the presidency, in defeating Henry Clay, much to his chagrin. And in some ways he's considered, you could make the argument that he was one of the best presidents the United States has ever seen. The reason for saying that is that he had 4 pieces to his party platform, and he did them all in one 4-year term. Some of these are pretty typical that we've seen. Reduce the tariff. That had been a big Democratic thing for a long time, and even the Whigs had somewhat cooperated in that as long as the tariff didn't go away. So that was easily enough done. Secondly, reestablish the sub-treasury system of Van Buren. If you recall, the Whigs preferred a true bank. And so during Harrison/Tyler's presidency, they had tried to undermine the sub-treasury system as a way to get the bank back. But Polk was going to re-establish sub-treasury, which he would do, and that would remain in place until the Federal Reserve System was established in 1913. So he was successful enough in that. Settle the Oregon boundary dispute with England. We looked at a map the other day about the 54-40 fight. The boundary dispute with England, when the United States purchased Louisiana from France, the boundaries were not very clear. And so England considered what we today think of as Washington State, Oregon State. England claimed that was part of Canada and therefore an English colony, versus the United States claimed much of Western Canada, stretching all the way up to halfway up Alaska, as part of the Oregon Territory. And if we had actually held to the 54-40 fight, we'd have actually claimed a huge chunk of Canada, which ended up not being the case. Instead, we settled on 49 degrees, which is the current boundary, and so you can thank James K. Polk for that they didn't get 54-40, but they did settle the boundary dispute with England. And finally, acquire California from Mexico, which he would do through the Mexican War. And regardless of whether we could debate all day, we could debate all day who the best president is. You have your Washingtons and Lincolns and Franklin Roosevelts, but it's not really debatable who had the best presidential mullet, because James K. Polk takes the cake. To talk about the causes of the Mexican War, we're getting into one of the bullet points for the IB that we could be tested on. And so, like with any war or conflict that we've been studying, we're going to look at causes, conduct, and effect. Causes, conduct of the war, and effects of the war. Remember, causes, we have 2 countries, the United States with about 70 years of history, and Mexico, a relatively new country with about 20 plus years of history behind it. And remember, that issue of neighborhood was one that stood out to the early Americans, right? Not wanting to have a system like Europe where we had conflict with neighboring states all the time and had a warlike system, a balance of power, alliances, and things that constantly preoccupied the U.S. and led to the necessity of a huge standing army that would do 2 things. A huge standing army was considered a danger to being a democratic country, and secondly, a big standing army is ridiculously expensive. And so conflict with Mexico was really not something that was looked forward to. As we've been stressing, harmony in the Americas was the U.S. policy for a long time. So why would two seemingly cooperative countries go to war? Remember that the Texas issue was a prominent one at the time. Texas was part of Mexico for hundreds of years. Native American Indians had lived there, and then Cortez conquered the Aztecs, and then it was part of New Spain. It was part of Mexico for hundreds of years, and then Mexico won its independence from Spain. And the region was relatively sparsely populated, and so they invited any and all immigrants willing to settle and develop the land to come and do so. And before you say that sounds really weird, why would they do that? They're just asking for it. Stop! Remember that the U.S. is doing the exact same thing. In the 1840s, what did we say there was a huge wave of? Immigrants from Ireland and Germany. Imagine if a wave of Irish immigrants settled in Iowa and said, okay, we're calling this New Ireland now. Hey, you gave us that land. We're going to secede and join Ireland. We would obviously not be very pleased. And so that's how Mexico perceives this, that they offered immigrants the chance to live in Mexico and obtain many benefits by living in Mexico, but Texas seceded. Mexico considered this an open question and still wanted Texas back. Remember, what was one of the big issues leading Texans to at first move to Texas, and then one of the main reasons they were then dissatisfied with Mexico? Yes? Slavery. Yes, slavery. The fact that they moved there as a place where slavery was legal, which in the United States was no longer very many places that were territories and had open and free land. It was mainly just Arkansas, the so-called retirement home for slavery as defined by the Missouri Compromise of 1821. There were not very many other territories with wide available land. The rest of the Louisiana Purchase, north of Missouri's southern border, had been closed to slavery. So that was a big reason. In response to, Texas submits a constitution to Congress. Texas says, we are the Lone Star state, we're a Lone Star Republic, an independent country, Sam Houston's our president, and they request to join the United States of America as a new state. And before the U.S. even accepts them, they're thinking about it. And that is enough to give Mexico reason to be very angry. And again, when you say, well, what's the problem? Again, imagine the same was true. 100,000 Irish immigrants moved to Iowa, and then Iowa submits some kind of Irish constitution. What would be our response? Very negative. We would say, Ireland, what the heck are you doing? And so they stopped paying U.S. debts. Governments exchange money all the time, right? You guys are probably familiar when people say, oh, we're in debt to China, right? Okay, well, it just means that the government has sold bonds to China. So this is not some horrible thing. It means Mexico was in debt to the United States, and they stopped paying that debt. Or if you also might recall recently when the U.S. was concerned about not raising the debt limit, we were going to stop issuing new debt, right? That happened somewhat recently. Well, they ended up backing down and making sure they paid all the debts, but if they were to not do that, that's what is considered default. And other governments consider that, in some cases historically, grounds for war if you stop paying your debt, because that's considered a vital agreement. Then they ban immigration, and the U.S. sends troops into Texas on what was supposed to be kind of a fact-finding mission, led by General Zachary Taylor, who you should know that name and tuck that in the back of your mind, to analyze the disputed territory. At the same time, this is sort of just a footnote, because this doesn't come to anything, but a man named John Slidell was sent to Mexico in order to try to purchase basically New Mexico, Arizona, California for $30 million, to which the Mexicans are not very interested. Here's a picture of Texas. The disputed territory here is all land that Mexico says, well, that's still part of Mexico, versus Texas is mainly over here, the independent country. And so, as I said, Mexico considered this an open question on several fronts. One, they really secretly hoped to get Texas back one day. And secondly, even if Texas was independent, they did not consider all of this land to be part of Texas. They considered that still part of Mexico, and therefore the Mexican army had jurisdiction there. The Mexican government could collect taxes there. Does that make sense? That actually, I mean, that matters. Where the boundary is, what country you're in when you are standing on a piece of soil can make a big difference. So we often talk a lot about this with World War I, is the issue of immediate causes and long-term causes. The long-term general cause is the Mexico conflict. It is really one of the main ones. But it's sort of sparked by an incident that's actually provoked by Zachary Taylor. He's sent to go investigate the territory, and he ends up building a fort rather than on the Nueces River, but he builds this Fort Texas down on the Rio Grande. Okay. He constructs Fort Texas on the north side of the Rio Grande, and the Mexican commander says, excuse me, General Taylor, you are over 100 miles across the border. You are deep inside Mexican territory. You have no jurisdiction to build a fort here. Again, imagine if we sent an army 100 miles south of the Rio Grande today and just started constructing a military base. They would hopefully politely inform us, excuse us, you are on Mexican soil. You have no jurisdiction to build bases in our country. And to their argument, they would say, this is Mexico. It's been Mexico for hundreds of years, or New Spain at least. And you have no... And that by simply being there, your army has crossed into our country and has begun building military fortifications. That's an act of war, right? That's an act of war, to go into a foreign country and start building military fortifications. And so there was a skirmish over the issue where some scouting cavalry fought off some other scouting cavalry, and shots were fired, and people were killed. Mexicans were killed, Americans were killed. President Polk calls for war on this issue, arguing that the U.S. Army was in Texas by the invitation of the legitimate Texas government, right? They had full authority to be there, and the Mexicans invaded Texas, and in so doing, killed members of the U.S. military who were there with the permission of the Texas government. Does that make sense? And so American blood had been spilt. So he calls for war in May of 1846. Now, because this war is the opposite of 1812, 1812 was an unmitigated disaster. This war is an unmitigated disaster for Mexico. And because the United States does so well militarily in this war, a lot of people point out specifically that the U.S. picked this war. It was aggressive. They were just picking on poor little Mexico, which is at best debatable, because at the time, many observers might put their bets, so to speak, on Mexico. They had a much more massive peacetime army, but they were unable to count on the fact that 100,000 volunteers would